Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Emmy. If you're new here, consider subscribing, checking out some of my other videos. I'll have them linked in the description if you're interested. Today I wanted to do a video on Twilight. I know, a blast from the past, but somehow or another it's found its way to continually be relevant throughout my existence, it seems like. Throughout my entire life, it has continually been promoted in the media, and some way or another, every 5 years now, it's been seemed coming back into fashion. So Stephenie Meyer just came out with her Midnight Sun book, finally. It's been way too long. I know back in I think it was 2015, she came out with the gender reversed book Life and Death, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, it just seems like this thing is never going out of style, and I'm interested in the ways in which it has influenced me and everybody else in life. See, Twilight's interesting because I think the first time around I was just completely mesmerized by the storyline. I had never seen anything like it, and I was finding myself obsessed with it. So I've been always interested in the ways in which it was different from media during the time. So what I'm going to be looking into more specifically is the general and overall appeal of Twilight and vampires media to young adults. And this kind of goes off of the hunter-prey complex that seems to go on, but more specifically Twilight does vampires and humans. And I think I'm going to be calling this the Twilight Dilemma, because over the course of the decade, in terms of the 2010s, it really overtook a lot of the media, and it influenced a lot of future novels, even if they were vampire related or not. So I'm going to be deep diving into the ways in which this dominant male figure took the minds and souls of these young adults and how it influenced them. So since this is such a heavy topic, I wanted to give out a few disclaimers before we begin. First off, we are going to be going over things such as self-harm, suicide, physical and sexual violence, controlling behaviors, and aggressive male behaviors. So if any of that is a triggering point to you, I would suggest clicking away. I just don't think it's worth it. Secondly, I want to say that I'm not saying Twilight created these issues, but that they further perpetuated them and failed to make note of them as being problematic. I also want to say that I was a Twihard myself. I spent many hours reading the books multiple times. I would go to sleep every night watching a Twilight movie. I can quote every single line from all 5 movies. So with that in mind and everything, I am not trying to make fun of anybody, trying to say anybody is stupid for liking these, because I still like these. I just kind of have accepted them for what they are, and before this I hadn't even done this much research on it, so I am just finding out some wild things, y'all. And with that being said, all of the research that I have done will be linked in the description, so if you're interested, please check those out. To start this off, I think I wanted to dive into why adolescents are such at higher risks for this dating and intimate partner violence. So statistics have shown that at this young age of being adolescents, they are at higher risk of intimate partner and dating violence, with injuries occurring more often in women than men. And researchers have turned to the media kind of as one avenue to look at the causes. This dating violence is also seeming to be gendered, so females are experiencing higher rates of victimization as compared to their male counterparts, and this can kind of be attributed to the socialization of gender, which we'll get into later. But adolescents are also at a higher risk of dating violence and stuff like that because of their heightened hormones during this time, and advertisers kind of know that this is a pivotal point in their life, it's changing, and they're at a vulnerable state. This is also the point in adolescence where you're kind of fantasizing about romance and finding a partner. So more specifically, to find the root of this power and violence struggles, researchers have often looked into the socialization of gender roles of the male and the female. And these researchers have noted that this intimate partner and dating violence is often linked to this power and control dynamic that is seen between these two genders. So the male and the female are then forced into their respective gender roles, and this socialization process often socially reinforces them into their role that feeds into this patriarchal society that then perpetuates this male privilege. Then these social norms that we have kind of promote the use of violence and control, so these males can remain in power over the female. And thus, tactics to exert power and control over someone else have been strong predictors of dating and intimate partner violence. So as we see later, it's when things are uneven and a relationship has power dynamic struggles where one person seemingly has more power over the other, where you face conflict and inequality. So we can see more specifically with Twilight, Edward is making all of the decisions for Bella, which is later reinforced by the fact that Bella is this weak human who can't make any decisions for herself. She's weak, and I'll later get into how I think the vampire and the human are gendered in themselves, but I think it's very interesting to look at how we have just accepted the fact that, you know, Bella shouldn't have any say in the things that she does just because she's seen as weak, even though it shouldn't matter. She should have a say either way. And you can see how this could be a negative effect on young girls, because they could be looking up to this and thinking, oh, should I want this in a relationship? Should I want to be seen as weak? Is that something I want? Do I want to be dominated? Maybe they do or not, but they're definitely being influenced by Twilight. I definitely had a certain mindset during that time. So I wanted to dive in more deeply to what is the appeal and relationship with vampires and violence. And to kind of better understand this in terms of how it's related to Twilight, I wanted to start you off with a quote from New Moon. What better way? And it's from New Moon, and Bella states to Edward, "What is tempting you more, my blood or my body?" Which we'll get into the blood and the body part in a little bit, but I just wanted to start us off with that. Recently, in the 2010s, I think, girls are more so picking these vampiric novels and books in terms of having it as a romantic novel as compared to a horror or fantasy. Now, the vampire fits this romantic formulaic demands of being a kind of hunky, mysterious, kind of gorgeous, strong male who's also available. And seemingly wants this mundane, so to speak, female part who, you know, wouldn't typically deserve someone at their stature and glory. And so this contemporary vampire has become known as something called a sympathetic vampire, where girls no longer fear them, but they identify with them. It's kind of like they no longer look at their vampirism as a choice. It's looked at as this victimhood of they didn't choose to become a vampire, so we should be empathizing with them and therefore dating them, I guess, because they're so handsome and they meet all of this typical romantic novel stereotypes formed with the fact of them being very extremely dangerous and wanting to suck their blood. So back to the relevance of the body and blood quote from New Moon, it's important to note that Meyer's narrative about vampires' thirst, which is connected to the allure of Bella's her pulse, her skin texture, the blood rushing to her cheeks, compared with the sexual allure and attraction of Edward to his physique, his skin texture, his skin temperature. Remember the scene in the car with the cold? Like, all of that is romanticized. Kind of by doing this, it creates the vampire as this literary device to focus on bodies, which when we talk about young adults, they're already culturally encouraged to focus on their own bodies, and so it's kind of like a perfect storm in terms of Twilight. And by having vampires, you also add that kind of cosmic life, spiritual element to an otherwise mundane life. It's no longer just a story about high school and just a story about love, but it brings the hype to another level, and it kind of feels more important and more intense. And I feel like in situations when things are life and death, people tend to like fall in love more. I know that's how I felt watching these movies. It's like the intenseness and the drama kind of draw you in, and when you're in such life and death situations with somebody else, it feels more important. And I think also during this time in adolescence, you're kind of expecting life to be more than it actually is. You think that you're kind of optimistic at that age, I think, that things are going to be the way you know, you've been told they're going to be, and maybe reality isn't as solidified as it is when you start to get older. So like I just talked about, this mingling of the spiritual and human worlds has been found to be one of the strongest appeals to Twilight. Since vampires are creatures that are related to things such as humanity and eternity, as well as death and sensuality, they have long served as a symbol and metaphor for this yearning. And what I mean by this is vampires need humans for their blood. While humans don't necessarily need vampires, we desire them and we admire them. They have this immortality, this beauty that transcends anything we have ever seen. And just think about it. Humans spend every waking moment trying to stay alive. We eat healthy, we exercise, we have medicine going, all these big hospitals, and we just try every day to stay alive. And they literally have just like cracked this code of humanity. And honestly, I remember when I was younger reading these novels, I wanted to be immortal. I was like, you don't have to try, you don't have to literally do anything. There's no sleeping, you don't have to eat. Like, all of your responsibilities are just diminished of just existing. Just think about how hard it is to just exist, and imagine just being a vampire and you can just like chill. So essentially vampires function to represent the fears and longings of young people. Essentially they're trying to escape reality, but aren't we all? And during this time, aren't we all? So now I'm going to look more specifically at Twilight, which was a phenomenon that took over the 2010s decade throughout young adolescents' lives. And because violence has been seen as an acceptable expression of love in these adolescents' relationships, it's important to look at the social messages that they have been receiving throughout the media, one of which was majorly Twilight throughout the 2010s and on, for that matter. And Twilight went on to sell about 160 million copies as of August 2020. So the first issue about Twilight that I would like to bring attention to is the way in which this novel has unchallenged gender roles throughout all of it. Meyer sort of chose not to concern herself with gender in any of these novels, which is not always a requirement of a novel, but it's the way in which it kind of perpetuates the stereotypical gender roles that has me concerned about the influence it has over the adolescents' lives. And specifically with Meyer, she has no questionably gendered her people inside of this universe. She has actually made her humans have female stereotypical gender, and her vampires have a male stereotypical gender. And I'll get into that a little more. So in Twilight, humans are seen as weak, inferior, breakable, in need of protection. And Bella Swan and her personality traits lend itself to that ideology in comparison to all the vampires around her. But it's important to note that this kind of goes beyond biological sex, in that it's no longer female tendencies linked to a woman and male tendencies linked to a man, but it is this vampires have been linked to male tendencies and humans have been linked to female tendencies in terms of traditional gender roles, if that makes any sense. So a vampire is seen as strong, superior, macho, has all those male gender characteristics, while a human has all the female characteristics of being inferior, weak, needing protection, breakable, all of those things you would see in a stereotypical gender of a female. It's interesting to see all of the swapped kind of roles in Twilight. So for example, when a male is in a human situation, it looks a little different than when a female is in a human situation. Take Mike Newton, for example. When we think of Mike Newton, I think of wimp. I think of, oh, this guy's lame, oh, he's weak, he's inferior. Take the scene from New Moon after he gets out of that scary, like, I feel like it was like a violent film. He got out of it and he was puking, and that's how they were depicting him. And Jacob's all like, "You feeling sick, man? Maybe you should go to a hospital." It's like, it's crazy how we even depict the males in the human kind of character as being weak, even though he is a male in a, like, traditionally a male should be seen as macho and all these things. I hope I'm making sense. And then on the other side, we have a female vampire such as Victoria, who should be seen as powerful, superior, and all of these things, and while she kind of is, there's a tinge of like a woman scorned, a woman who's angry and bitter and over dramatic and shouldn't be doing all these things. And so you see how there's like a double-edged sword to both of these things, that it's not always traditional and fair, and so it's very confusing, and it's kind of reinforcing these gender roles. And when you go out of these gender roles, you're seen in a negative connotation. And I would just like to read this quote that I found from a research article that states, "The human world and the world of monsters wouldn't seem out of place half a century ago between housebound women discussing the active world of men and career. But Bella's constant disparaging remarks about herself throughout the narrative often allow Edward Cullen's abusive behavior. Because she is human and he is a vampire, he is excused." So we're no longer seeing it as his behavior is okay because he's a male, it's his behavior is okay because of vampire, because he's biologically superior. And so because we've gendered the vampire as a male, it has become kind of blurred, and the typical gender roles have been blurred, and we kind of seeing these issues in a fragmented way, but in all reality there's still issues of gender and gender inequality. And Bella also convinces both herself and the reader that she needs protecting, continually perpetuating this need and this gender inequality. And because vampires and humans are seen as biologically different, these differences of inequality should not be questioned as compared to a man and a woman, which is also another ball game to tackle in itself. Now, it's interesting to note that Stephenie Meyer came out with Life and Death, which is a role reversed, I guess gender reversed, novel back in 2015, which is all fine and dandy if you want to say it would have had the same effects. But I think it's very naive of her to think that the original novel didn't have the impact it did on stereotypical gender roles and how it had this like dominant and submissive effect on young adults. So the next issue about Twilight that I would like to bring attention to is the amount of physical violence we see throughout the series. And a research article that I was reviewing identified 80 instances of violence throughout the series, and 30% of it being initiated through an intimate relationship. And more specifically within this category, 66% of the violence was perpetrated by Edward on Bella, and the other 33% was perpetrated from Jacob on Bella. So physical violence is often seen throughout the series. An example of this is when in New Moon, Bella gets the paper cut and she is literally like tossed and thrown across the room. And yes, Edward is trying to save her from being attacked by Jasper, but at the same time, if they hadn't even been in this relationship and situation in the first place, she wouldn't be needing to be thrown across the room and injured by a table of glass. So it's just like kind of putting perspective on, yes, he's saving her, but at the same time, why are we fantasizing about this relationship that can put her in so much danger? It was also noted that Bella was a victim of 96 other instances of violence, but this kind of violence was secondary violence, and this was often made by other vampires throughout the series. And this continual exposure of being with Edward is placing her at a higher risk to be exposed to all these other vampires who basically want her dead and don't understand why they're even together in the first place. And Edward himself poses a risk as being a vampire because, you know, there's an allure to her blood, and more specifically, she is a specific kind of human being with blood because she is what is known as a singer to Edward, which goes into the fact of, is he with her because he is attracted to her, or is because he is attracted to her blood? A singer is something that's like, it's specific to each vampire, and there's only like one or two, I guess, in the universe that their blood sings to them so much and it's so attracted to them that it's so hard to resist, which is bizarre in itself. She also goes through some internal struggles when she has the baby during Breaking Dawn, and it's like, the reason why she's going through this pain of having this baby is not because of natural childbirth, no, it's because there's a human who is giving birth to a vampire baby human hybrid who is literally eating and drinking her own insides to survive in itself, and it's literally killing her. And I feel like over the course of this series we've romanticized this relationship, and even to this point it's like I remember thinking like, oh, you have the baby, it's so cool, a hybrid. Like, no, she's literally gonna die for this baby who didn't even need to exist because this relationship shouldn't even have existed in the first place. And I'm not insinuating that Edward meant for any of this violence to happen to her, but it was just a result of them being together that kind of caused this violence to continue, and it's important to note that while he didn't mean any of these things still happen, and I think it has a lot to do with today and today's society when we talk about intent. Your intent doesn't matter, but the effect does. So whether or not you meant to harm this person, she's still over the ground over there with glass shards hanging out of her arm, and so is this what we continue to want to do? And I know he left the new moon, but that bitch didn't stay left. He came back. And we all know what happened when he left, though. It's like she was depressed and all this thing, and it was an insane. The storyline is insane. And it's also important to note that a lot of the violence and injuries that Bella endures is often excused for the fact that she's clumsy, but I would like to point out that the injuries that she sustains throughout the series do not add up to the amount of clumsiness you are. You shouldn't be getting sucked of your blood with venom coursing through you because you fell. Like, they don't add up. It doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry. The next issue that I would like to bring attention to throughout the Twilight series was the sexual violence that Bella experienced throughout it. In this specific research article, there were 5 instances of sexual violence that Bella had experienced, either by Edward or Jacob. And an example of this was in Breaking Dawn, when Bella woke up from the honeymoon the first night they had sex. And I'm going to read you a quote from Breaking Dawn that kind of explains what had happened. So it says, "Under the dusting of the feathers, large purplish bruises were beginning to blossom across the pale skin of my arm. My eyes followed the trail they made up my shoulder and then down across my ribs. I pulled my hand free to poke at the discoloration on my left forearm, watching it fade where I touched and then reappear," which is on page 89 of Breaking Dawn. So although Bella and Edward do not engage in sexual relationships until after they are married, which is also a source of people that like to promote this series because it's encouragement of abstinence, their relationship is not one that is non-violent. It is a very violent relationship and is very aggressive. And I think you can see this in the kiss they have in New Moon, where it's like right before he leaves and he kisses her on her birthday, and it's just the agony in his eyes. That was like the most uncomfortable kissing scene I've ever seen in my life. He looks in so much pain. And my problem with that is, like, we're romanticizing this relationship, like we're rooting for them to be together, and it's like he's literally fighting the urge not to rip into her neck and kill her. This is so problematic. And just same thing with the honeymoon. He bit into that headboard. He had bruises all over her body. It's just like, we should not be romanticizing that. And on the same coin, Jacob is not innocent to any sexual violence. He had come on to Bella 2 times through forcibly kissing her. And after the first time, Bella reacted obviously by punching him in the face, and then sadly she broke her hand in the process. Now that would be all fine and dandy, except for the fact that after she broke her hand, she became a form of amusement. So in the research article, they state that Bella's injury and distress are then the cause of amusement for both Jacob and Charlie, which trivializes Jacob's perpetration of sexual violence and Bella's victimization. So we're therefore encouraging this kind of behavior by making amusement out of her trying to fight back and the fact that, oh, he was just trying to kiss her, so silly, blah blah blah. I would like to give kudos though to Edward, because his reaction was very level with what happened. He wasn't necessarily mad at Jacob because he kissed his girlfriend. He was more so mad at Jacob because he kissed Bella without her permission, which is refreshing to see because he could have easily gone the jealousy route. It's also important to note though that he had to do it all macho man way by getting all up in Jacob's face, and he's all like, "If you ever go against her again, just wait for her to say the word," and she would, it's just the whole macho man, just it ruined the whole moment of Edward doing a good thing. Then they had to play into the gender role and, and then just further try to perpetuate the idea that Bella needs saving and protecting and she can't kind of stand up to herself on her own. The next issue that I'm going to talk about is kind of controlling behaviors that were identified throughout the series. And in this same research article, this was a juicy one, guys, gotta check it out. There were 30 instances of physical control that occurred primarily from Edward trying to control Bella, but also there were some instances of Jacob trying to control Bella and other characters. There was also verbally ordering Bella to do things and kind of controlling her through that way, and it was recorded that they controlled her verbally 31 times, and then lastly there was 58 instances of emotional control that primarily Edward did over Bella. And I'm going to give you some example of Edward's use of violence for the purpose of controlling Bella's behavior, and they're illustrated in the following quotation, which Edward imitates Bella. "Where do you think you're going?" He asked, outraged. He was gripping a fistful of my jacket in one hand, and that occurred in Twilight. Or there's also the instance where Edward is requesting other characters to control Bella's behaviors, where he says Emmett, and Emmett kind of stops Bella in her tracks in Twilight. Or by threatening violence to ensure that Bella complies with his wishes, so Edward says, "No, no, no," Edward roared, charging back into the room. He was in my face before I had time to blink, bending over me, his expression twisted with rage, which that occurred in New Moon on page 535. So as you can see, there is a lot of controlling behaviors, all centered around trying to tell Bella what to do because she is seen as weak and fragile and seemingly like she has not enough power to decide what she wants to do and what's best for her, which is not something I would want to be promoting to young adults. Like, we want to promote like these young people's voices and that they have control over their own bodies and what they want to do. So I think it was just like a very ill message that we were sending to adolescents. The next issue in Twilight that I would like to bring attention to is the self-harm and suicide behaviors that we see throughout. Throughout the series, there were 60 instances of these suicide or self-harm behaviors, and throughout the series, 66% of them were Bella's. And within this category of Bella's behavior, 3 different themes had emerged. And so the first one was her ideation with becoming a vampire and kind of enduring this intense pain and transformation that would ensue ultimately her death. I mean, vampires are not seen as living humans, they are seen as dead. And so she is willing to ensue this death upon herself to be with her eternal love, essentially, which is very problematic to be kind of promoting to young people, that they should be enduring this kind of pain to have the love of their life. The second theme of suicide and self-harm that Bella goes through is in particularly New Moon, when she goes through all these suicide and self-harm attempts just to see a hallucination of Edward, which is very problematic in itself because, you know, she's not receiving any help and she's just doing these reckless things just to see a hallucination. And it's also important to note that she's going through this deep depression all the while, and so it's very hard for the reader to understand if these are just attempts to see Edward or if she genuinely is this reckless and would rather die than live another day without Edward. This is further romanticizing the idea of their relationship being that epic that she would need to commit suicide because she's never going to find anything as great again. And lastly, there's a suicidal theme throughout Bella, that she's willing to risk her life to save other people, particularly vampires who are already dead, or in these life and death situations where they're gonna die, and she's willing to put herself as a human 17-year-old girl who's barely seen any life in front of all these vampires. And more specifically, I'm going to give you an example. During the fight with hostile vampires, Bella has the following thoughts: "If I had to bleed to save them, I would do it. I would die to do it." Repeatedly, images of suicide and self-harm are romanticized in the book series. There's also that scene in Eclipse we see where she actually does slit her wrist to distract Riley and Victoria from snapping Edward's neck. Here you have Edward, who's lived like 100 years, 100 and some years, and Bella, who's only lived 17, willing to risk her life literally at the scene to save Edward, and because they're so in love. And I think that's further romanticizing their relationship, which is a problem in itself. So the next problematic behavior that we have seen throughout Twilight is this kind of stalking behavior, and the research article that I have been using as a guide identified 14 instances of stalking behavior, 11 of which were done by Edward to Bella, and this included things like breaking into her room without her knowledge, listening to her conversations, following her, and monitoring her interactions. So I have an example from Eclipse, which states that Bella visits Jacob against Edward's orders. When she returns, the following ensues. "It came out of nowhere. One minute there was nothing but bright highway in my rearview mirror. The next minute the sun was glinting off a silver Volvo right on my tail." So Edward uses stalking techniques as a means of manipulating and controlling Bella. These behaviors are both minimized and romanticized from Bella's reaction or lack thereof, where she states in Twilight, "You spied on me, but somehow I couldn't infuse my voice with proper outrage. I was flattered," which is from Twilight on page 292. Next, we have examples of male aggression that occur 183 times throughout the series, so there is not a lack of those. This is like machoism, male superiority, and male privilege, stuff like that we see throughout the entire series, mainly exhibited through by Edward or Jacob to Bella. So this is like displaying male aggressiveness to exert territorial dominance over a female, which occurred 43 times and was either presented through expressions or of possessiveness by Jacob or Edward toward Bella in establishing their dominance when confronted by another male. So, for example, in Eclipse, when Jacob attempts to warm Bella up by getting into their sleeping bag with her, the following occurs. Edward snarled, but Jacob didn't even look at him. Instead, he crawled to my side and started zipping my sleeping bag. Edward's hand was suddenly hard on his shoulder, restraining, snow white against the dark skin. Jacob's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring, his body recoiling from the cold touch. The long muscles in his arm flexed automatically, which is on page 490 in Eclipse. So we had a pretty hefty list of examples from Twilight that kind of were problematic in their own respect, and mostly all of them I have found to be romanticized and glorified. So the stalking can be kind of seen as romantic and flattering. Even Bella says it herself. She's communicating that to us readers, that this is something to be desired in a partner, which is just really weird. That goes along kind of with the controlling behaviors too, stalking and controlling, kind of just trying to assert their dominance over them, and we shouldn't be encouraging this for young adolescents. There's also the obvious aggression and physical violence that occurs throughout it, which we can kind of dismiss in some regards because of it being vampires, but I think as an overall arching theme, we in these series kind of use vampires as a way to mask the completely gendered environment that we have in here in their stereotypical roles. Instead of it being male and female, we have human and vampire, and it's kind of masked in that sense, like I talked about before. I did also want to briefly discuss other vampire and vampire related novels, series, movies, TV shows like that, just to kind of get an idea of the influence it may have had and what had occurred after Twilight in a sense. So there was the Vampire Diaries that started in 2009 and went all the way until 2017. Started a little after Twilight, but I think it has its core differences throughout. And one of them being was Elena never willingly wanted to become a vampire. She strongly held on to her humanity and was always against becoming a vampire, something that Bella was highly for. She really wanted to become a vampire and died to be with Edward forever. It is also important to note about the Vampire Diaries though that Damon does exhibit some controlling behaviors, but it's an important fact that by choice or not, Elena goes against everything that Damon kind of tries to control her to do. Even when she is human, she goes against it. It's not just when she becomes a vampire that she goes against it. But I think a lot of times Elena makes it a point to make her own choices. It is also kind of problematic that Damon is romanticized even though he kills without remorse, and it's kind of seen as this serial killer complex of the main character being in love with this person even though they kill a bunch of people and they seem to don't care about it, and yeah, they're a vampire, but it's the way in which the audience interacts. Like, I know I was Team Damon, which is like, but like, it's just, you can't help it sometimes. There was also the classic 50 Shades of Grey, which is actually a spin-off from Twilight, and it literally just takes a vampire perspective and puts it in contemporary, like, real-life scenarios. And there's this whole, like, BDSM, which takes, like, an actual idea of a dominant and submissive, and I think it is a real, like, sexual encounter thing that people do. I don't know anything about it. That's the extent to which I know it, but it very heavily reflects the relationship between Edward and Bella, and it just further promotes this romanticization of the power dynamics between these two characters. And while I know in 50 Shades of Grey there is a female dominant, primarily the dominant is male and the female is submissive because that's what our main characters are. And lastly, I would like to bring up After, the movie that came out on Netflix in 2019. That was a novel, I think it was a Wattpad, that was a fanfic of Harry Styles, which is funny in itself. but it kind of has those same dominating behaviors, and I remember watching it and I was getting the same feeling that I used to get when I watched Twilight, and so it was just very, like, I was just very triggered by it because I had been in the point in my life where I knew that that feeling was not, like, good. I don't want to be that kind of girl, and I don't want to be in those kind of romanticized relationships where it's, like, abusive and bad and, like, all these things, and, like, it just kind of gave me those similar feelings of, like, the glorification of abusive relationships. So going back to the overarching problems throughout Twilight, this series has exhibited instances of controlling and violent behavior, which is often minimized through vampiric normalcy, like I talked about before. It is often romanticized, and it's often just, like, justified in its actions. We're idealizing these relationships when they're abusive in nature, which is counterintuitive to what we want to be promoting to young adolescents. The majority of the controlling and violent behaviors, like the stalking, the violence, the controlling, the intimidation, all of this was perpetrated by the male characters in this series. And these central characters, these male central characters, manifest these behaviors and then further perpetrate these male stereotypical gender roles, such as being aggressive, dominating. Considering the popularity of these books and the marketing toward young adolescents and young adults, it is important to note that these messages are counterintuitive to promoting a healthy, equitable, and non-abusive relationship. I think there was a quote that said, "This is especially true with regard to sexual violence, since the representation of a sexually violent relationship seems to be in direct contradiction with advocating for abstinence." So while you have this series that kind of seemingly advocates for abstinence, you have one that is very violent at that, and so it kind of just, like, diminishes anything that it might have been promoting in kind of waiting for marriage, which is not even a hold fast rule in terms of everyone in society. So that is basically all that I have researched on the topic of Twilight and all the issues and problems that I have found throughout it. I know throughout my lifespan I have had different thoughts and opinions on Twilight, but it was never until I researched and dived into the characters and kind of dynamics of characters this deep that I actually did start to see the underlying issues that this series kind of presented throughout the decade. And it still continues to be a huge, like, media force throughout adolescence. I mean, for Christ's sake, it came out with Midnight Sun just 2 months ago. So it's still very relevant and it's still having lasting effects. I know that I'm still trying to, like, kind of break down the wired misogyny in my own brain and the kind of gender norms that we have kind of placed upon ourselves and society because of these novels like this and media like this, that it becomes so hard to decipher what is real and what isn't. And it's just like, remember, kids, gender is a social construct. So if you're interested in any more kind of deep dives like this, let me know in the comments. And I really hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe if you want more from me, and I'll see you next time. Peace.